I'm Nathan, 27 years old, and I can tell you exactly two Christmas stories. There's the one I lived inside of as I grew up, and then there's the one I've been quietly creating, piece by painstaking piece, ever since I understood that you get to choose where you set your own table. Until this very year, the version of Christmas my family always celebrated felt like a play, and my Aunt Linda was its undeniable, unchallengeable star. She possesses a voice that can slice through even the loudest music and the most cheerful holiday chaos, ringing out like a sharp, insistent bell. And she, quite literally, narrates everything, from the precise way the potatoes should be mashed, to the ideal fit of a new sweater, and most importantly of all, to the exact way I should be feeling about myself at any given moment. If you're unlucky enough to have a relative who consistently mistakes absolute control for genuine love, then you know her type intimately. As children, we became experts at reading her mood before we even had a chance to finish taking off our coats. Would we be met with a tight, brittle smile and an almost condescending, "Oh, there he is," or the dramatic, drawn-out theatrical sigh, inevitably followed by, "Oh, good, you made it." The running joke in our family was that Linda's sigh was our very own Christmas wreath, utterly reliable, always evergreen, and if you paused to think about it for more than a second, just slightly depressing. This year, however, my mother called me, her voice soft and carefully rehearsed, asking me to simply be kind for the night. I think, deep down, she longed for Christmas Eve to feel whole and undamaged again, the way it did when Grandma was still alive, her steady hand a constant, comforting presence on Linda's shoulder. Grandma had this extraordinary way of making space open up around people, a quiet magic that even compelled Linda to lower her voice when Grandma's gentle gaze rested on her. But after Grandma passed away last spring, the air in the house shifted. It felt thinner, somehow, as if the ceiling had soared higher and all the familiar warmth had simply spilled out. While everyone else searched for Grandma's essence in old ornaments and beloved recipes, I found her in crisp legal folders and carefully worded clauses, because she had appointed me the executive of her trust. It was a job I almost turned down. The lawyer's office smelled faintly of lemons and sheer, exhausting effort. The daunting list of responsibilities pressed against my chest like a second, unfamiliar spine. But I said yes. I said yes because Grandma had asked me months earlier, one warm evening on her porch, her bare feet resting against the weathered boards, night bugs softly thudding against the screen. She had squeezed my hand, her grip surprisingly firm, and said, "You, Nathan, you see people as they are, and yet you still look for what they could be. That, my dear, is a trustee." That single line of hers anchored me through the summer's relentless storm of paperwork and hushed phone calls. It also quietly, powerfully, taught me the profound difference between achieving simple justice and claiming outright victory. If you've ever belonged to a family where one person hoards and dictates the entire narrative, you quickly learn to author your own story in the margins. I grew up mastering small, strategic escapes, a second, unprompted walk around the block, an offer to take out the trash that needed no taking out at all, or visits to Grandma's house that always stretched out for one more cup of tea than I'd originally planned. Linda, predictably, preferred my cousins, especially her son, Tyler, not because they were inherently better people, but because they so perfectly mirrored back her meticulously crafted vision of what successful, grateful children ought to look like. Tyler always seemed to have the newest, flashiest gadget or latest trend, and he wore his good fortune like a hard-earned badge. "He earned it," she'd declare, often with a pointed look in my direction. Some of us, you see, believe in excellence. I remember vividly when we were teenagers. She said this while filming Tyler's impressive pile of presents to send to her friends, the camera casually swinging past me and the two modest books I had specifically asked for. She posted it anyway. Every holiday, it seemed, brought its own small, stinging humiliations. There was the year she launched into a lengthy speech about how respect is earned, and then with theatrical flourish called on us, one by one, to list a single thing we appreciated about her. I mumbled something about her good cranberry relish. Her face instantly pinched into a frown. She had clearly been expecting. "You're the backbone of this family." Then there was the Christmas. I painstakingly put together a slideshow of cherished family photos, including some raw, tender moments from the hospital when Grandma was growing weaker. Linda interrupted a mere 10 seconds in, declaring, "No sad stuff tonight," and promptly switched it to a looping montage of Tyler's college sports highlights. She laughed, a brittle, forced sound. "We need to keep the energy up." And my mother, bless her heart, laughed too. Not because it was genuinely funny, but because it was simply safer. Somewhere in my early 20s, I finally learned to stop offering things that truly mattered. Bring cookies. Bring extra chairs. Bring nothing fragile. When Grandma died, those existing fault lines in our family widened into chasms. At the will reading, Linda sat stiffly in a bright, almost glaringly red coat, a warning light unto herself. She had been absolutely, cosmically certain that Grandma's beloved house would be hers, outright. Instead, the trust meticulously outlined a slower, far more careful plan. The house, it stated, would remain within the family trust until we, collectively, decided its future. Any sale or renovation would require a full consensus from all beneficiaries. And then there was a clause that stunned everyone but me, a small discretionary fund to be used for community good in Grandma's name, controlled by the trustee, which was, of course, me. Linda's face didn't so much fall as it sharpened, a fine blade honed by indignation. She squeezed the arm of her chair, managed a saccharine smile at the lawyer, and declared, "Well, I'm sure we'll all do what's sensible," which, in Linda speak, translated precisely to what I've already decided. On the sidewalk afterward, she leaned in close, her expensive perfume bright and cold. "You're far too young for this, Nathan. Don't make a mess of your grandmother's legacy." I simply nodded, because nodding, I've learned, is a language all its own. All through that summer and fall, I met regularly with the lawyer, walked through the house with an appraiser, and began the quiet work of setting up that tiny fund in Grandma's name. New winter coats for the kindergartners at her church, a much-needed repair for the swing set at the park where she'd pushed me when I was small. I didn't post about it on social media. I didn't send out an email thread or blast pictures to our family group chat. My intention was quiet and stubborn, just like Grandma's own. The only person who knew the true details was my mother, who listened intently and often cried, because it reminded her of her own mother in ways that both hurt and, miraculously, healed. "Your aunt is going to absolutely hate not being in charge," she whispered once, her voice laced with empathy. "I know," I replied, "but that's a form of grief, too." Then December arrived. My mother called the week before Christmas Eve, asking carefully if I'd come to Linda's, as usual. "Everyone's going," she added, which is our family's unique way of both inviting you and issuing a subtle warning in a single breath. I said yes. I'm not a martyr, but I was genuinely tired of letting other people dictate where the meaning of a holiday truly lives. Besides, I had a plan. Not for spectacle, not for revenge, but for dignity. It started with one unexpected thing. I booked the town's charming little historic venue, an old library gracefully repurposed into a community hall, just down the street. It would host a surprise cocoa and carols in Grandma's name event on the same night, starting a little later. Free entry, music from the high school string quartet, and cookies baked by Mrs. Ramirez, who had brought countless casseroles to my grandparents every time they fell ill. That quiet fund paid for everything. I spoke to the venue manager a week in advance, and together we even drafted a contingency call script, just in case I needed it. "Just in case there's interference," I'd said, trying desperately to find a word that didn't sound like a direct accusation. She simply raised an eyebrow, a knowing look that told me she'd seen 100 families in our exact shape before. "Understood," she'd replied, her voice calm. "We'll be ready." Christmas Eve at Linda's house looked exactly as it always did. A dining table groaning under the weight of enough food to feed a small village. Decorations that were just slightly too perfect. Magazine tidy rather than memory warm. And a carefully curated playlist that allowed for absolutely no slow songs. When I arrived, Linda's eyes did a quick, almost imperceptible calculation. She hugged me, but her gaze was already sweeping over my shoulder, assessing who might be behind me. "Nathan," she said, her voice crisp as a new bill. "So good you could make it." The living room was a vibrant, sugar-bright cacophony of cousins, aunts, the clink of glasses, and the kind of laughter that blends into a general crowd noise rather than a genuine feeling. Tyler sauntered in from the porch, carrying a box of extra ornaments, as if he were transporting precious treasure. "Look who decided to be festive," he grinned, tapping my shoulder. "You even dressed up for once." I glanced down at my sweater. It was, I thought, a perfectly normal sweater. He smirked, still wearing the boyish grin of the kid who always got away with everything and somehow learned that it meant he was important. I had brought a single gift, wrapped simply in plain brown paper and tied with a humble red ribbon. Inside was a small, beautifully framed photo of Grandma in her garden, her hair pinned back, proudly holding a ridiculous, oversized squash she had once grown and laughed about all summer. I'd had the photo carefully restored and printed from the original negative. Grandma looked so vibrant, so utterly alive, you almost expected her to blink. The frame bore a subtle inscription, her name, her years, and a line she had said to me 100 times when I doubted myself. "Start small, but start." The gift was for my mother, the one person who had always, without fail, tried to meet me exactly where I stood. I slid it gently under the tree. I wasn't trying to make a statement. I was simply trying to hold onto a person. Dinner was its usual, predictable parade. Linda loudly pointed out who had brought which dish, meticulously crediting all the ones she herself had made, and a few she'd bought but deftly passed off as her own. She peppered Tyler with questions about his work, nodding loudly when he answered, so that her nods felt less like agreement and more like a carefully orchestrated round of applause. When I spoke, she found a way to dismiss my contributions by calling them interesting, which in Linda speak is a velvet-lined box with absolutely nothing inside. She even asked me, with a thinly veiled smirk, how playing money manager was going, as if I'd taken up juggling. I said it was going fine. "No small disasters yet," she prodded, and everyone laughed, because it costs nothing to laugh when the joke isn't on you. The living room naturally drifted toward the tree afterward. We have a tradition of opening gifts one by one, from youngest to oldest, with Linda narrating the proceedings like an auctioneer. Wrapping paper drifted onto laps, and polite thank yous were carefully rehearsed. My mother sat beside me, squeezing my hand under a blanket. "I saw the ribbon," she whispered. "You always find the good red." I smiled without thinking. Linda was in her absolute element. "Oh, that's from us, sweetheart," she'd chime, until my humble present surfaced. Tyler's girlfriend, digging through a tinsel avalanche, found it and held it up. "This one's pretty," she said genuinely. Linda took it smoothly. Her eyes flicked to the tag. She stared a half-second longer than usual, and I watched the subtle shift, the way she seemed to settle a familiar crown back onto her head. She cleared her throat and turned towards me, her voice sweet, but with a poisonous point. "You don't belong here. Give your gift to someone who deserves it," she said, landing each word like a tiny, sharp dart. Conversation instantly paused, rippling outwards in concentric circles. The cousins exchanged those small, nervous laughs teenagers make when they're trying to figure out which direction to point their faces. Tyler's lips pressed into something that tried to be both a smile and an apology at the same time. My mother softly said my name. Linda reached for the present, and in one fluid motion, handed it to her son. "Tyler's worked so hard this year," she explained, her tone like a teacher dividing stickers. "Let's not pretend otherwise." In a family like ours, the moment just after the blow is where the weather truly changes. There's the initial gust of shock. Then everyone steadies themselves, falling back into the unspoken script. Maybe someone makes a nervous joke. Maybe someone offers a gentle chide. Maybe someone just says, "Not now." I'd been on the receiving end of those small, internal storms for years. And the thing I learned is that not every response belongs on a grand stage. Some responses work far better in hallways, in quiet driveways, in forgotten corners where consequences can truly hear themselves. So I stood up. I gave my mother a look, hoping she understood. "I'm okay." She squeezed my wrist, a silent affirmation. I simply said, "I'm going to grab some air." Linda spread her hands as if she'd made a profound point about maturity. "Good idea," she chirped, almost giddy. "Come back when you're settled." Outside, the night held a clean, sharp cold. You could see your breath, a fleeting ghost in the air. The neighborhood shimmered like a scene in a perfect snow globe. Soft porch lights, glitter strung along roof lines, the distant thud of a car door closing. I walked to my car and sat with my hands on the steering wheel, needing to hold still, feeling like something vital might otherwise fly out of me. I thought about Grandma, bending over the soil, patting it gently like a good dog. I thought about the will reading and Linda's jaw, tight with fury, when she realized the house wouldn't simply hand itself over. I thought about my mother, watching me on that couch, torn between ingrained loyalty and deep, abiding love. And then I thought about the small, quiet party I'd secretly arranged down the street, where Mrs. Ramirez had already laid out trays of cookies wrapped in plastic, and the quartet was even now tuning up in the old reading room, under a festive wreath. The venue manager and I had agreed on a phrase for the cell phone call, in case we needed to move things forward. "The library is open." I dialed. The manager answered on the first ring, as if she'd been standing right by the phone. I gave her the phrase. Her voice didn't change, but I could hear a faint smile in it. "Understood," she said. "We'll open the doors in 10 minutes." I asked her to make one extra call to a number I'd given her earlier, the only other person who knew the full plan. She promised she would. I hung up and stared at my reflection in the rearview mirror. I looked tired, yes, but there was a quiet steadiness in my face that surprised me. I know some people picture fireworks when they imagine revenge. Mine was simpler. Mine was just a door opening where another had just been slammed shut. When I stepped back inside, the house felt suddenly warmer, louder. The present I'd wrapped sat untouched on Tyler's lap, almost like a dare. Linda looked immensely pleased with herself, in a way that subtly, inexplicably, made the entire room feel dimmer. She caught my eye and performed concern. "Are we centered?" she asked, her voice syrupy. I said yes. The cousins, already bored, drifted back toward their phones. My mother looked at me, a question in her eyes. I answered with a small, reassuring nod. And then the front door opened again. My Aunt Marlene, my mother's older sister, who usually avoids conflict like it's a second job, walked in from the cold, even though she had, in fact, been there all evening. She still had her coat on, her car keys clutched in one hand, and she said in a voice I've only heard twice before, "They're starting down the street." "What's starting?" Linda asked, laughing a little, bracing herself for some joke that would keep her firmly in control. Marlene didn't smile. "The thing for Mom," she said, her voice firm. "At the old library. They're lighting the tree in the courtyard, and the kids are singing. Mrs. Ramirez called me because she said she didn't want the hot chocolate to go to waste." She did not look at me, and I felt that familiar mix of gratitude and sorrow I always feel around the truly kind. "I'm going," she added, like someone quietly declaring the start of a march. She slipped her arms into her coat as if making an unshakable decision. Silence at a family gathering is a strange, potent thing. It doesn't look like quiet in the real world. It looks like 100 tiny, internal calculations. It sounds like distant jingle bells from somewhere you can't quite place. Tyler looked at his mother. Linda made a face that clearly said, "Stay." But the room had already shifted an inch, a crucial degree, and you could feel the difference, like when a plane subtly dips. My cousin Zoe stood first. Grandma loved the library, she said, her voice small, yet utterly stubborn. She picked up her coat. Then Aunt Teresa, who rarely, if ever, contradicted Linda, stood too. "I'll drive," she said, as if stating something less would only mean more fighting later. The door opened and closed and opened again. It wasn't a rush. It was a series of polite, determined exits. Shoes thumped softly on the mat. The celebratory music in the living room suddenly felt too loud for the dwindling number of people still listening to it. Linda tried desperately to scoop the air, the moment back toward herself. "No one is leaving," she announced, her cheerfulness almost tyrannical. "We have dessert. We have the exchange. This is our tradition." But tradition, I've learned, is ultimately what we do, not simply what we're told to do. My mother stood without looking at me. She pulled on her coat and buttoned it with hands that, to my surprise, didn't shake. She possesses a kind of quiet courage that you can only truly see from the inside of a family. "I'll be back," she said to Linda, and then, almost gently, "if there's anything to come back to." Linda laughed again, but fewer people mirrored it this time. I didn't gloat. I didn't point at the door and launch into a triumphant speech. I just stood and watched, mesmerized, as warmth reallocated itself. This was never about trying to make Linda feel small. It was about making crucial room for something bigger to finally breathe. A family is a lot like a house. You can choose to live there with all the windows painted shut and convince yourself it's safe. Or you can finally open one and let the heat move freely to where it's truly wanted. Tyler carefully placed the brown paper present back on the coffee table, still untouched. He looked at it the way you look at things that have irrevocably shifted meaning in your hands. "We'll open this when you're calmer," Linda told me, as if she hadn't just rewritten the tag herself. She seemed almost giddy now, buoyed by the sheer challenge of regaining control. "No one is going anywhere," she repeated, louder now, as if sheer volume might glue people to their seats. That's when the doorbell rang. It wasn't timid. It was the confident, resonant ding-dong of someone with undeniable authority over the next few minutes. Linda's head snapped toward the entryway, as if the very house had somehow betrayed her. Tyler set the present down more carefully than I expected. In the hallway, a shape moved behind the frosted glass, and I recognized the outline even before the knob turned. The venue manager's sensible wool coat, the kind you wear when your job encompasses both warm hospitality and firm decisions. She stepped inside when the door opened, her cheeks pink from the crisp cold, a light cap of snow dusting her scarf. "Hello," she said, her voice warm but businesslike. "I'm so sorry to interrupt. I'm from the community hall down the street. We're starting the event for Mrs. Hill." She paused, kind enough to let Grandma's name settle gently in the air, and quite a few people are already arriving. "We just wanted to make sure the family knew. We have cocoa waiting and a little room reserved." She looked around the room the way good managers do, not challenging, just softly inviting. "Everyone's welcome." The effect was immediate and incredibly gentle, like a quiet whisper at the very center of a crowd. A few more cousins stood up. Two neighbors, who always drifted over to Linda's house on Christmas Eve because it felt somehow safer than their own, murmured to each other and reached for their coats. My Uncle Greg, who rarely took a stand unless it involved the proper way to carve a ham, cleared his throat and said, "Your mother loved that old place, Lynn." He put on his hat like it mattered. Even Tyler's girlfriend, who had never pushed back on anything in her life, slipped her hand into his and said, her voice soft, "I want to go hear the kids sing." Something flashed across Linda's face. Panic, perhaps, thin and silver. She stood very straight. "This is ridiculous," she said, her voice sharp with disbelief. "We are in the middle of Christmas. This is our home." The manager nodded, as if she'd heard that 1,000 times and knew precisely how to step around it. "Of course," she said, "and we'll be there for another hour, and then we'll clean up and lock up. We just didn't want you to miss the carols." There's also a memory table, if you'd like to bring anything." She glanced, almost imperceptibly, at the brown paper gift still sitting on the coffee table. No accusation, just possibility. I bent to pick up my coat. My hands were steady. My mother caught my eye across the room. She didn't know the intricate details of my plan, but she knew enough to recognize a chair being pulled out for her and for the people she loved. Linda opened her mouth to begin a new paragraph, the kind where she gathers people with a story they don't get a chance to revise. She took a breath. The manager waited, hands clasped, a cloak of professional patience wrapped around her like another layer of wool. More feet shuffled toward the hall. The music from the Bluetooth speaker stuttered and then mercifully stopped, as if the house itself were listening intently for the next line. And then Linda turned directly toward me, with a look I hadn't seen since I was 12 and stubbornly refused to trade away the baseball card my grandfather had given me. It wasn't simple anger. It was a complex weave of offense braided with utter disbelief, as if the world had suddenly tilted on its axis, and I was personally responsible for gravity. She took one step closer, lowered her voice, and said with chilling precision, "What exactly do you think you're doing here, Nathan?" I opened my mouth to answer. Just then, the door behind the manager swung wider, letting in a fresh bite of cold air and a scatter of new voices from the street. Someone laughing, someone calling a name, the ethereal swirl of a violin warming up. The room teetered delicately on the edge between two very different versions of the same Christmas night. My reply was right there on my tongue, simple and careful, the truth scaled perfectly to the moment. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't even move closer. I just said, clearly and calmly, "I'm doing what you would have done." And I tilted my head toward the open door, as if it were a path forward rather than a challenge. Linda's eyes narrowed, as if I'd offered a cryptic riddle instead of a straightforward sentence. For a fleeting second, I saw the room reflected in her pupils. The coats half on, my mother carefully buttoning the last button with that familiar, stubborn care, the manager waiting patiently in her wool. Linda's hand tightened on the back of a chair. "No one is being manipulated out of my home on Christmas," she said, each word bright and hard. "Please stay, everyone. We've planned a beautiful night." I thought about all the nights that were only beautiful because we were told they were. I lifted the brown paper gift off the coffee table and slid it into my coat pocket. It fit just. Then I turned and walked toward the door without another single sentence. It wasn't an act of defiance. It was an act of orientation, like choosing to face a window in a crowded room. Behind me, shoes scuffed and whispers folded into each other. I didn't look back until I reached the entryway. My mother had quietly fallen in beside me. She squeezed my arm once and said, her voice soft but firm, "Don't say anything yet." It wasn't a warning. It sounded like she knew I'd been saving words for far too long, and she wanted them to land precisely where they mattered most. Outside, the air held the sharp sweetness of cold and, surprisingly, cinnamon, as if someone had spilled it on a scarf. A little line had formed on the sidewalk. Aunt Marlene was at the front, Aunt Teresa beside her, Uncle Greg tugging at his hat, cousins nodding to each other the way people do at airports when they've agreed on a shared gate. We stepped off Linda's porch and continued down her walkway, the yard lights casting soft gold onto the fresh snow. Behind us, the door closed with a decisive, final click. I could almost feel Linda's relief at the sound. Asterisk seal the house. Keep the narrative. Asterisk, but the street belonged to December now. A neighbor waved from her porch and called out, "We're heading there, too. Save us seats." The manager led us, not quite in front, but always just near enough, like a kind usher, making sure no one got lost. The old library's entry lanterns wore festive wreaths. Through the glass, you could see garlands looped along the railings and the soft, inviting glow of a dozen lamps. Someone had hung a banner over the check-in table, in loving memory of Florence Hill, cocoa and carols for the neighborhood. When I'd chosen the font last week, I'd cried in the dark over my laptop because, ludicrously, fonts shouldn't hurt. Now, seeing it printed, a profound steadiness lifted in my chest, like the inverse of panic. Mrs. Ramirez met us at the door with a tray of tiny marshmallows. "For floating," she said with a knowing smile, "because details are how you show love when you don't have the right words." She winked at me. We saved some extra for the late arrivals. She knew exactly what kind of late this was. Inside, the quartet tuned their instruments softly in a corner, their cases half closed like sleeping animals. A group of kids in knit hats clustered near the memory table we'd set up under the big front window. I had placed a guest book there, 2 pens, and a small inviting sign. Share a story, big or small. Someone had already left a faded photo of Grandma at a church potluck, balancing 3 plates in 2 hands, her eyes twinkling with laughter. A neighbor had written, "She taught me to make biscuits that didn't fight back." A man I barely recognized had simply written, "She never forgot my name when I moved here alone." Beneath the table sat a sturdy box labeled "Coats. Take what you need." I'd worried there wouldn't be enough sizes. Now, looking at the growing stack, I was grateful for every tag I'd clipped and every sleeve I'd folded in my living room, where the cat had tried to help by sitting stubbornly on the pile. People streamed in behind us, the sound rising softly, those muffled winter sounds, quieted by scarves and the tender, aching way you love someone who isn't physically in the room anymore. My mother drifted to the memory table and laid her palm flat on the cloth, as if checking if stories still kept their warmth. She picked up the guest book and smiled at a particular note. Aunt Teresa wiped her eyes with the corner of her sleeve, then, embarrassed, laughed about her mascara. I found the manager again and thanked her. "You did this," she said, her smile genuine. "I'm just the person who unlocks the door." I handed her a folded note. Final instructions for the donation jars in the back. The stipend for the quartet. She didn't unfold it, just tucked it into her pocket and said, "I'll make sure it all goes where you intended." At first, I thought I had imagined it, the distinctive sound of footsteps that are more posture than footfall. But then Linda's silhouette filled the doorway behind the last group of neighbors. She didn't shake the snow from her boots. She didn't lower her voice for the quiet reverence of the hall. She stepped inside like a high school principal arriving late to an assembly, the kind who expects the entire room to immediately adjust to her presence. Tyler was a step behind her, his shoulders stiff, his eyes fixed on the floor. When Linda saw the banner, her mouth pulled tight. She was dressed for hosting, a vibrant red scarf, a brooch shaped like a snowflake large enough to be a silent confession. "We're leaving in 10 minutes, she announced, to no one and everyone all at once. She stood near the door, not truly joining the room so much as hovering at its very edge. I didn't go to her. I didn't try to usher her into the center. I took my mother's hand and walked to the front, where the quartet's music stands leaned at a slight, expectant angle. The players nodded at me. We'd rehearsed the order of songs the day before. I turned to face the room. The quiet that gathered wasn't the hush of fear. It was that gentle, respectful bend of attention rooms give when grief is, for a sacred moment, the guest of honor. "Thank you for coming," I said, my voice careful, clear. "My name is Nathan. I'm Florence's grandson." Around the edges of the hall, heads nodded in that knowing. "I remember you from the garden party way." "She loved this place," I continued. "She taught me to trace my finger along the spines of the books and pick the one that made my hand tingle. She said that was your mind saying, 'Take me home.'" I kept it short. I told the story about how Grandma once organized a neighborhood sing-along right here during a blizzard when the power went out, and how she used the librarian's flashlight like a conductor's baton. I thanked the quartet for playing and Mrs. Ramirez for the cookies and the teenagers for their sheer willingness to sing. Even though it's such a risky thing to open your mouth in front of adults and try, genuinely, to be sincere. I mentioned the coat box, the memory book, and the jars by the door for those who wanted to donate to the elementary school's winter fund. I did not say the words trust or executive or clause. This wasn't about documents. This was about a person whose absence now had weight and whose presence in this room had even more. While the quartet eased into, "Oh, come all ye faithful," I moved quietly to the memory table and gently placed my brown paper present in the center. The red ribbon made a clean X on the paper. A small candle in a jar flickered beside it, the wick briefly drowning and then bravely catching fire again. My mother stood close enough that I could feel the warmth of her sleeve. "Should I open it?" she whispered. I nodded. She tugged at the end of the ribbon, carefully, the way she had taught me when I was small, as if even paper deserves gentleness. The framed photo slid out, the glass catching the lamplight. Grandma's garden face smiled out at us, ridiculous squash and all. The inscription glinted at the bottom. "Start small, but start." My mother touched the words. She didn't cry. She laughed. The little, breathy laugh she gives when something hurts and heals at the very same time. She would have loved this, she said. She would have told that squash story twice. I felt Linda before I saw her. The air changed a subtle degree behind my shoulder. She set her bag on the table with a decisive thump, as if claiming a space that was rightfully hers. "This is sweet," she said, drawing out the word with patronizing emphasis. "But family time is inside. Nathan, you've made your point." She looked past me, directly at my mother. "Come on, Emma. Everyone's waiting." My mother threaded the ribbon around her finger and didn't lift her eyes. "I am here," she said simply. It wasn't a challenge. It was a sentence, standing firmly on its own feet. Linda tilted her chin toward the banner. "Using her name without consulting me is inappropriate," she said. She kept her voice light for the room, but the edges pressed in, sharp and hard. "As the senior member of the family, I think we should discuss how these things are handled." I almost smiled at the phrase handled, as if grief were a folding chair you could simply stack and will into a closet. I swallowed once before I answered. "It's a community event," I said, in her memory. I kept my voice quiet, not to hide, but to make anyone who truly wanted to hear lean closer. "There's nothing to manage." Tyler hovered nervously behind his mother, like a shadow that desperately wanted to be its own shape. He looked at the guest book, then away, then back again. "Grandma liked the library," he muttered defensively to no one in particular, as if he needed it to count as an opinion. Linda touched his elbow, and he instantly straightened. We could have stayed there, locked in a polite tug-of-war of phrases, if not for Aunt Marlene, who had somehow discovered bravery as if from a long-lost drawer. She stepped confidently to the memory table, lifted the guest book, and said to the small crowd around us, her voice clear, "Would anyone like to share a story?" She didn't look at Linda. She didn't look at me. She looked at a kid with a beanie pulled low over his ears. The boy cleared his throat and said, his voice muffled into the mug of cocoa in his hands, as if it could hold his voice for him. She helped me with my reading every Tuesday when I had to stay late. She didn't tell anyone I mixed up B and D. Laughter hummed softly in the room, small and true. The kid's mother squeezed his shoulder. Aunt Marlene beamed. "That's a Christmas story," she declared. The quartet slid into silent night. People sang softly. The hall gathered the sound and gave it back, warmer. In the middle of the second verse, I noticed Linda. She wasn't looking at me, but at the jar on the table with a little slot cut into the top. She was counting the folded bills with her eyes. Sometimes you don't realize what someone truly watches until you see what holds their attention. Her jaw set. When the song ended, she clapped twice sharply and said, "All right, lovely," with the energy of someone deciding precisely where to put a wall. "Before anyone gets too swept up," she continued, her voice rising, "I think it's important to remember that Florence's affairs are not a public matter. Nathan has been enthusiastic, but there are proper channels for memorials." She straightened the edge of the tablecloth by half an inch, a gesture so small and so controlling it could only have been meant for me. We will be hosting dessert at our home shortly. Let's wrap this up." There was a small stir, the kind you hear when a flock notices movement. Not because they want to follow, but because they want to register the change. I realized then that I wasn't the only one who had prepared for this exact moment. The manager stepped forward with a man beside her, his thin coat collar up, carrying a leather folder. "I'm sorry to interrupt again," she said, her voice regretful but firm, "but Mr. Abrams just arrived." She gestured to the man. "He asked to speak to the family at the event when everyone was here. He said it would be brief." Linda's smile went rigid, the way ice goes shiny just before it cracks. "We are not having legal conversations in a public hall," she said, her voice taut. "This is extremely inappropriate." Mr. Abrams looked gently apologetic and, at the same time, utterly immovable, the way good lawyers look when they've already read the next 5 lines of the page. "I promised Florence I would deliver a letter to her family on Christmas Eve, in a room that was not anyone's living room," he said. He didn't raise his voice, but the shape of his words carried, clear and deliberate. She was very specific. She asked that it be read where neighbors could hear if they wished. I felt my mouth go dry. I hadn't known about any letter. The trust I'd handled for months didn't mention Christmas Eve or public words. For a second, I thought maybe he had the wrong hall. But the way he looked at me, steady, kind, like he'd seen my grandmother write my name on an envelope, made my stomach tip. He opened the folder. Inside lay a thick, cream-colored envelope, sealed with a tiny red sticker. In Grandma's familiar loops and corners, the front read, "To my daughters, my grandchildren, and whoever shows up when cookies are free." Someone laughed. A sudden, unexpected release of tension that made other people laugh too. Mr. Abrams held the envelope up, allowing the light to catch the red square. "If you prefer, we can wait," he offered. Not to Linda, but to the room itself. "I can read this at the end after songs." From the corner of my eye, I saw Linda's fingers twitch toward the envelope, a flicker of pure instinct. "You will not," she said, low and venomous. "This is a private matter." He nodded, as if he'd expected that very sentence and had already set down a place for it. "Florence anticipated that concern," he said gently. "She wrote this letter for both places, the table where people break bread and the hall where they pass coats to one another. She told me that if either place is full of people who loved her, both places have earned the right to hear." The quartet, unsure whether to play, let their bows hover above the strings. In the back, Mrs. Ramirez arrested her hand mid-sprinkle over a plate of cookies and held it there in rapt attention, like a cartoon character smelling pie. The kids in hats pressed closer, drawn by the delicious possibility that a grown-up might read something dramatic out loud. My mother slid her palm into mine with a small squeeze I felt all the way up my arm. Linda's face went through microclimates: surprise, calculation, irritation, determination, then settled on the weather she wears most often: certainty. "Absolutely not," she said, her voice brittle. "If there is a letter, it should be read in our home with the family. That's how we do things." She put her hand flat on the envelope as if it were a runaway napkin she needed to subdue. Mr. Abrams didn't tug. He just tilted his head and said, his voice acquiring the quiet authority of someone who knows which words truly carry weight, "May I ask you to remove your hand, Mrs. Collins? The letter belongs to the people it names." In a different year, in a different December, that might have worked. The insistence on our home, the bright invitation subtly reframed as an order. But people had already taken off their coats and put down their heavy feelings. You could feel the room deciding, not with a cheer, but with a collective lean. Aunt Marlene said, her voice clear, "Florence loved a good letter," as if it were a vote already cast. Uncle Greg, his hand still on his hat, added, "She read them at the table every year." Which was true. The thankful letters at Thanksgiving, the Christmas card from the neighbor deployed overseas. The manager stepped back, letting the room keep its own momentum. I thought about stepping in. I thought about making a speech, a reasoned argument to grease the edges. Then I remembered the porch, and the night bugs thudding against the screen, and my grandmother's hand over mine when she called me a trustee. Trust is a verb before it's a noun, she'd said once, after a Sunday sermon about action. Asterisk, not everything needs a defender. Sometimes you just need a witness. Asterisk, Nathan, Linda said, turning back to me, like she could still make the entire scene pivot if her words found the right hinge. If you care about your grandmother's legacy, you will stop this. Bring everyone back to the house. We'll read whatever that is with just us. That's how it's done. Her voice was persuasive on its surface and panicked underneath, like a polished floor over thin ice. I opened my mouth, ready this time. I wasn't going to apologize or explain. I was going to say her legacy includes the people you don't invite. I was going to say you don't get to decide who belongs. I was going to say start small, but start and let the sentence stand like a little cornerstone. Excuse me, came a voice from the doorway, breathless and bright. Everyone turned. Tyler's girlfriend had hustled back from the coat rack, her cheeks flushed, phone in hand. I think you should hear this first, she said, her eyes darting between Linda, me, and Mr. Abrams. She swallowed, her voice a little shaky. It's the video from last spring. The one. Linda's head whipped toward her. What video? She asked, too fast, too sharp. Tyler's girlfriend looked at him for half a beat, some private conversation ricocheting between them, and then back at the rest of us. The one of Grandma, she said, her voice shaking but steadying itself mid-sentence. The one where she held up her phone. On the screen, paused at the first frame, was Grandma on the porch in her summer sweater, the one with the small embroidered flowers. The timestamp in the corner read, May 18th, 8:07 p.m. I recognized the angle. Whoever had filmed it had been sitting in the wicker chair opposite her. The video title was just a date. No description, no headline. But below it, in the tiny preview of the first few seconds, was Grandma, lifting a sealed, red-stickered envelope that looked exactly like the one currently under Linda's hand. The room collectively inhaled. Tyler closed his eyes for a second, as if he could change a detail of the past by focusing hard enough on the present. When he opened them, he looked at me, not his mother. He looked afraid, and also strangely relieved, like he'd been holding a heavy box all year and someone had finally opened a door. Play it, Aunt Marlene said, her voice picking up an authority she didn't even know she possessed until tonight. The quartet lowered their bows all the way this time and leaned in like everyone else. Linda's hand flattened harder over the real envelope, as if proximity could somehow erase evidence. Absolutely not, she snapped. This circus ends now. We're going home. She reached for Tyler's wrist, a gesture so practiced it could have been reflex. He didn't move. I took one step closer to the memory table, not to block or anchor, just to be near the place where the two versions of the night were now irrevocably touching. Mr. Abrams glanced at me, then at the phone, then at Linda. He adjusted his glasses, as if the next few minutes had been underlined in an email I hadn't read. Play it, my mother said, almost apologetically, like she was asking for a song she knew the quartet already had queued up. Tyler's girlfriend's thumb hovered over the play triangle. The room held its breath in that particular way rooms do when something is about to be said that can never, ever be unsaid. Linda's jaw worked, crafting a sentence that could build a wall fast enough to stop a moving car. And then, without looking at his mother, Tyler reached out and gently, deliberately, lifted her hand off the envelope. He didn't rip or push. He simply slid her fingers away, like removing a delicate leaf from a book. Linda stared at him, utterly shocked at this new angle of gravity. He didn't meet her eyes. He looked at Mr. Abrams, then at me, then at the phone. Play it, he said. The little triangle brightened. Grandma's voice filled the old hall. That distinct summer and rasp, and that low musical cadence she used when something truly mattered. Nathan, she said to whoever was behind the camera, and Linda, clear as the lantern light outside. The hall went so still you could hear marshmallows sinking in cocoa. That's exactly when the front door swung wider, and a winter gust curled in, carrying with it a crowd sound from outside and a figure momentarily obscured by the swirl. A familiar silhouette stepped over the threshold, stomping snow from boots, lifting a hat, and the screen in Tyler's girlfriend's hands flickered, as if the past itself had taken a breath. Grandma's voice on the little screen had a rhythm that silenced everything else. It was both intimately familiar and strikingly new. The way she always started important sentences with a meaningful pause, like she was making space for you to lean in, to truly listen. "Nathan," she said again, smiling warmly toward whoever held the camera, "and Linda, since I know you'll listen in whether or not this is meant for you tonight, I'm making something official." She held up the very same envelope that now sat under Mr. Abrams's arm, sealed with the red sticker. "This letter, you'll have it later, but I want my words on film, too, because people can argue with paper. They can't argue with the sound of your mother's voice." Linda's hand twitched in the air, as though she could still snatch the video out of existence, but the phone kept playing. "I've lived a long time watching what happens when one person tries to hold all the strings," Grandma continued, her voice filled with gentle wisdom. "It strangles the joy out of people. Families need more than one voice, more than one place to sit at the table. So I've made choices to make sure no one—" She glanced straight at the lens, and somehow it felt like she was looking straight at Linda— "can turn love into control." Murmurs rippled through the hall. The kids in knit hats stopped fidgeting. Even the quartet musicians held their bows suspended in midair, as if the music they had tuned for belonged, fundamentally, to this voice instead. Grandma leaned forward in the video, her expression firm but loving. "Linda, you love fiercely, but you confuse possession with care. You will not inherit this house. You will not inherit decision-making. You will inherit my recipes, my photo albums, and my sincere hope that someday you learn that leadership is service." She turned, her gaze softening. "Nathan will manage the trust because he listens before he speaks. And to the rest of you," she waved her hand, as if blessing the entire room, "don't let holidays become cages. Open doors for one another." The screen flickered to black. The silence afterward felt like snow falling softly inside the hall. Linda's face was pale, her jaw tight enough to crack a tooth. "This is manipulative," she snapped. "You can't possibly think—" But she stopped abruptly when she realized no one was nodding along. Not a cousin, not a neighbor, not even Tyler. He looked at the phone in his girlfriend's hands, then at me, then at the floor. "I knew about the video," he admitted quietly, guilt spilling through his voice. "She made me promise to keep it until tonight." "I didn't know how to," he swallowed hard. "I didn't know how to go against you, Mom. I'm sorry." Linda's lips parted as if she'd been physically slapped. For the first time in years, she had no quick retort, no cutting remark. She stood rooted to the spot, every inch of her carefully constructed control crumbling in a room that no longer obeyed her. Mr. Abrams unfolded the envelope with slow, deliberate precision. "Florence asked me to read this once her family had gathered," he said. "Since her words have already begun, it seems only right to finish them." He drew out the letter, pages lined with the same elegant, curling script I'd seen in every birthday card she ever wrote. He began to read instructions for the trust, reassurances about fairness, but also small, piercing truths. She named the people she wanted to thank, the values she hoped would last, and then the exact phrase that made my mother cry silently into her sleeve. "Emma, you are my gentlest daughter. Don't let anyone convince you that kindness is weakness." When the letter ended, the room erupted in applause. Not polite clapping, but the kind that comes when tension finally breaks and everyone, together, decides which side they're on. People rose to their feet. Some hugged, Some laughed through tears. My mother leaned her head on my shoulder, whispering. Her voice choked with emotion. She saw everything. Everything. Linda tried one last time. "This spectacle doesn't change tradition," she hissed. But her words fell flat, instantly swallowed by the swell of carols as the quartet began to play again. This time, the music didn't wait for permission. The room sang along, voices shaky at first, then stronger, a powerful chorus of people reclaiming what truly belonged to all of us. Linda, stiff with outrage, gathered her bag and stormed toward the door. Tyler lingered, visibly torn. Finally, he shook his head, a decisive gesture, and stayed behind, slipping his hand back into his girlfriend's. "I'm done pretending," he said softly to himself, to them, to the room. Linda left alone, her boots crunching down the frozen steps, her shadow shrinking against the snow. I didn't follow her. I didn't gloat. I stood in the warm glow of the hall, watching neighbors and relatives line up to sign the memory book, drop coins and bills into the jars, and share stories about Grandma that stitched warmth back into the cold December night. My little gift, the framed photo, sat on the table where everyone could see it. People pointed at the ridiculous squash in Grandma's arms and laughed. And in that shared laughter, she was alive again. As the night slowly wound down, I stepped outside. Snow had started to fall in steady, soft flakes, gently softening the edges of the world. My mother joined me, her breath making little clouds in the crisp air. She slipped her arm through mine. "You did it," she said, her voice full of pride. "You gave us back Christmas." "No," I answered, watching the hall glow softly behind us. She did. "I just opened the door." We stood there a while, the sound of carols spilling out into the winter street until even the stars above seemed to hum along. And for the first time in years, I felt like I truly belonged, not because someone had finally allowed me to, but because no one ever again could take it away.